So we came to the conversation about the development of oocytes, female gametes. It's very similar conceptually, one in males, and it starts with a cell called oogonium. Remember, in males it's spermatogonium, in females it's oogonium. It's a diploid cell, and at first it undergoes mitosis, producing a primary oocyte. Primary oocyte is the part of primordial follicle, the earliest stage in the follicular development. So this happens before even the birth. So it is happening during the fetal stage of female development. In the childhood, primary oocyte, is arrested in the prophase 1 of the meiosis. Now, starting at puberty, every month, a single primary oocyte enters meiosis, and this meiosis corresponds to the follicular development from primary to secondary to the vesicular or antral follicle that is mature and is ready for the ovulation. This meiotic development basically completes, meiosis 1 is completed. And remember, the result of the first stage of meiosis is 2 haploid cells. So you have one haploid cell that is called polar body, and it essentially is being dissipated. And you have a secondary oocyte. Secondary oocyte enters meiosis 2, but gets arrested in the metaphase 2. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is that during the metaphase 2, that secondary oocyte has the all its chromosomes, each containing 2 sister chromatids, lined up at the equator of the cell, but it's arrested at this stage. It's waiting. Okay, does that make sense? And this is secondary oocyte, and secondary oocyte is ovulated. This is something I want to highlight for you. It's not an egg. You see, the cell did not complete meiosis 2 just yet. So upon ovulation, you now have the secondary oocyte here, and you have 3 polar bodies. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Now, secondary oocyte becomes an ovum only if it's fertilized by spermatozoa. Does it make sense? Let me say this again. So secondary oocyte, which is arrested in meiosis 2, if it's not fertilized, it will remain secondary oocyte and die secondary oocyte. If it's fertilized by spermatozoa, secondary oocyte completes meiosis 2 and becomes ovum. An ovum is practically automatically fertilized in this case. Does that make sense to you? Now, let me ask you a couple of questions. First of all, general question about the meiosis. Meiosis starts with the diploid cell. We clear? Now, how many cells are produced as the result of meiosis in general? That's meiosis 4. If we talk about meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, it's 4 cells. These 4 cells, are they diploid or haploid? Haploid. So from 1 diploid, you end up with 4 haploid. Right? Now, look at these 4 haploid cells. How many of them are reproductively functional? Just 1. Now, try to remember the meiosis that leads to the generation of spermatozoa. It also starts with a single spermatogonium, but you end up with how many functional spermatozoa from 1 spermatogonium? 4. And that actually reflects a very interesting evolutionary adaptation that are different in males versus females. The function of the male spermatozoa is to fertilize an oocyte, right? Produce fertilized ovum. Correct? Now, think about it. I kind of feel weird talking about it, but think about this. Spermatozoa, they leave the male body. They gone. Male has no responsibility, biological responsibility, after the ejaculation. Does that make sense? Fertilized ovum is going to stay in the female body. So it's going to implant, it's going to develop. For instance, these 3 polar bodies at the bottom, these tiny little circles with N in the center, they're going to degenerate, and they're going to provide the initial nutritional support to the fertilized ovum. Does that make sense? Now think for a second. If woman would produce during meiosis every month 4 oocytes instead of 1, then in 1 liter, yeah, my wife had twins, and that was enough. Okay? Imagine every possible liter would have at least 4. Okay? That is unconventional. In fact, if you would look at kind of switch from human physiology to comparative physiology, you would notice one interesting thing. The larger the animal, the smaller the liter. I don't know of any examples of twins in elephants, for instance. Okay, big animals like deer, elephants, humans, they usually produce smaller liters compared to, say, rodents or even cats or dogs. Okay, that makes sense? And we can do all kinds of ecological reasons for it and stuff like that. So we're going to be talking about ovarian cycle, and I want to first present the anatomical features of the ovarian cycle, and then we're going to talk about hormonal changes, because I pay most of attention, your attention and my attention will be directed to the hormonal regulation of the ovarian cycle. Okay, so ovarian cycle is the process in which, well, I should say not egg, but oocyte matures. Ovarian cycle consists of 2 stages. Follicular, which runs from day 1 to day 14, and luteal, that runs from day 14 to day 28, separated by the culmination of that cycle, the process called ovulation. 28-day cycle is rare. Follicular stage varies between women. However, luteal stage, the 2nd stage, is constant. So let's do a brief overview It happens during the follicular stage. So here, you can see the primordial follicles. One of the primordial follicles every month develops into the primary follicle, the primary oocyte, which then undergoes changes, including anatomical changes like thecal cells form theca folliculi, antral cells form antrum. All these cells are necessary for the proper maturation and nutritional support of the developing oocyte. And eventually, secondary follicle develops into the mature vesicular or antral follicle. You can see zona pellucida that surrounds the oocyte and the antrum. Zona pellucida essentially prevents the penetration of any sperm cells at this point yet. I'm sorry. So at this point, meiosis 1 is completed, and oocyte is arrested in the metaphase of the meiosis 2. And antral follicle or vesicular follicle, call it whatever you want, undergoes the ovulation. During ovulation, the follicle ruptures. The oocyte is released. What is formed as the result is the structure called corpus luteum. Can you see the developing corpus luteum on top? It says steps 6 and N6. Okay, 2 steps 6. Can you see that? I circled it massive. Now, before we chat a little bit about the fate of the corpus luteum, I want to ask you a really simple question. Secondary oocyte. What 2 main outcomes are awaiting for it in the future? What can happen? Say again? No, polar bodies are separate. So you have 3 polar bodies and 1 secondary oocyte. What can happen to secondary oocyte? Come on. Say again? Or not. Or not. So 2 options. Either secondary oocyte is fertilized, right? Or not. If not, it will be released with the menses. Story's over. If it's fertilized, and we presume that everything goes as planned, oocyte's fertilized, meiosis is completed, you've got fertilized ovum, that ovum migrates into the uterus, implants into the uterine wall. That make sense? Starting at this implantation, story changes. You see what I'm saying? The whole routine, if I may say so, changes, because now you cannot shed stratum functionalis. You have to make sure that that blastocyst that's implanted into the uterine wall properly develops. Does that make sense? Depending on the fertilization or not, corpus luteum may remain or not. If secondary oocyte is fertilized, then corpus luteum will last for some time, providing necessary hormonal support for the implantation of the blastocyst. But if secondary oocyte is not fertilized, corpus luteum will degenerate into the structure right here that is called corpus albicans, the white body. Corpus luteum means the yellow body, and corpus albicans means the white body. Got it? Now, hormonal regulation. In my opinion, this is the most elegant hormonal regulation process that I know of. It's much more complicated than our typical feedback loops that we can observe in the regulation of the spermatogenesis, hypothalamus, pituitary gonadal axis, or any other axis like hypothalamus pituitary adrenal or hypothalamus pituitary thyroid. So what happens here? It all starts now. This is really important. I'm going to be asking questions about it. And understanding that regulation is crucial, not only for the exam, but for your future profession. So, if you lose track of what I'm talking about, or if you're confused, something is unclear, stop me right away. There are many steps here. Deal? It starts in hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will release gonadotropin releasing hormone that will get to the anterior pituitary. In response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, which two gonadotropins are going to be produced? LH and FSH, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. So far we're clear? Now let's take a look what these hormones do. First of all, let's think about name, follicle stimulating hormone. What does it do? Stimulates follicular development, exactly. So follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the follicular development. That makes sense? In the meantime, luteinizing hormone will act on the thecal cells, and that action of luteinizing hormone will essentially stimulate the elevated level of estrogens. Does it make sense to you? Now, before we move on, I want to ask you this. Do you remember what is the essential outcome of luteinizing hormone acting on the male testes? It stimulates testosterone. What's the essential outcome of luteinizing hormone acting on the female ovaries? Estrogen. You see, it's homologous function. It stimulates testosterone, the male sex hormone, and stimulates estrogen, the female sex hormone. You clear? And sort of by analogy, FSH acts on the Sertoli cells, kind of controlling the development of spermatozoa from oogonium, and here FSH acts on the follicle. Good? Now, the next thing is really weird. That's the step that's weird. And you have to understand, that's the situation. I hate this expression, but there's an expression, it is what it is. I think it's a ridiculous expression. It is what it is. What did you say? You just said nothing. But what I'm trying to tell you is, next step, it's basically what we observe in females. This is how the development happens. There's no question, why does it happen this way? You know, what's the reason? This is what happens. Am I clear? So, estrogen, first of all, it establishes the negative feedback loop. That's kind of unexpected, isn't it? So estrogen that is produced by ovaries inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone and release of FSH and LH from pituitary gland. Does that make sense? It doesn't stop. You have to understand it doesn't stop. It just kind of controls it very tightly. However, in the meantime, what happens to the size of the follicle? What do you think? Yeah, it increases. It becomes bigger, right? Now, if it becomes bigger and more thecal cells can produce estrogen, what's going to happen to the levels of estrogen? It's going to go up. So estrogen slowly climbs up. Does it make sense? Now, look at the left side of the flow chart, this side. It's a bit convoluted, but can you tell me what kind of loop do estrogen and LH establish? Positive or negative feedback? Huh? Negative. That's negative feedback because estrogen inhibits the synthesis and release of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. Does that make sense? Estrogen levels in the meantime continue to rise, and eventually that negative feedback switches to positive. Yes, that was the proper facial expression. I found the mechanisms. I don't remember the exact some molecular stuff is going on there. Okay, I don't remember exactly what changes specifically, but the point is that right before the ovulation, the feedback becomes positive. So elevated estrogen leads to elevated LH. Does that make sense? Now, elevated LH will lead to elevated estrogen, which will elevate the levels of LH even more. Does that make sense? That leads to the surge in the levels of luteinizing hormone and ovulation. Clear?
So is it just like a threshold that the estrogen levels hit and then it switches?
Yep, like a threshold. Estrogen levels, that's a really good analogy. Yes.
So it's pretty similar to the male axis until it reaches that threshold.
Until it reaches the threshold. Exactly. Yes. Because in males, you need to accumulate a substantial amount of sperm to start seriously inhibit. Because before the sperm counts climb up, the only hormone that controls its production is testosterone. When they climb up, then inhibin kicks in and it really slows down. Okay? Now, luteinizing hormone surges. Secondary oocyte is released during ovulation, and it leaves behind it corpus luteum. Good? That's seen here. Corpus luteum produces three main hormones: inhibin, estrogen, progesterone. Now, guess what feedback loop is re-established after the ovulation is over? Negative feedback. Now, corpus luteum, here's the deal. Hold on. Corpus luteum produces, I'm going to focus on estrogen specifically because it's probably the most powerful. Produces a lot of estrogen. Now we have negative feedback, right? So what does estrogen do to levels of LH? Decreases. What does it do to levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone? Decreases. As they decrease, remember it's a negative feedback, as GnRH and LH decrease, what after that happens to estrogen levels? They also decrease, And when estrogen levels decrease, what happens to the levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone? They go up, LH goes up, the cycle starts over. No? This is the part that I'm willing to spend as much time as we need. This is why, look, I don't want, okay, we got it, let's move on. Okay. Let's do it differently. Let's do the graph, okay? Let's do the graph. Here, the graphs. Can you see the graphs? And we're going to add some more hormones on this graph. You with me? You ready to follow? This is where we start. Okay? First of all, which hormone stimulates the release directly, the release of LH and FSH? So you see levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are pretty stable, right? Now, luteinizing hormone, what does it stimulate? Which estrogen? Follicle stimulating hormone, what does it stimulate? Follicle stimulating. Follicles. Now remember, follicle becomes bigger and bigger. And which structure in the ovaries produces estrogens? No. Which structure produces estrogens? Thecal cells that are found in where? Thecal cells that are found in where? In a follicle. So as follicle becomes bigger, what happens to the levels of estrogen? That make sense? Now this part here, what kind of feedback do we see? Negative feedback. So far we're clear? That part. So estrogen rises. How does it affect the levels of luteinizing hormone? Keeps it low. Keeps it low. Yeah, you can see it. Keeps it low. Now, why estrogen rises despite the fact that luteinizing hormone levels are fairly low? Because what becomes bigger and bigger? Follicle that produces estrogen, just more cells. We good? Which feedback starts here? That's positive. So at this point, elevated estrogen how does it affect the levels of luteinizing hormone? Increases luteinizing. And increased luteinizing hormone, how does it affect estrogen levels? Increases them. Do you see that? Do you see that on the graph? Aaron, can you see on the graph that elevated estrogens elevate luteinizing hormone and vice versa? Okay, because you were a bit confused.
No, I wasn't confused. I was understanding as to why women have, they are crazy around that because of the surge and drop and surge and drop.
Oh yeah, yeah, and reproductive hormones have an enormous effect on mental state. Absolutely. Now, this right here is ovulation. Okay? Now, remember, it's still positive feedback. So when luteinizing hormone levels fall down, what happens to the levels of estrogen? They go down too. Okay, so here you see them getting down. Can you see that? Negative feedback reestablishes about here. Now an interesting step starts. Corpus luteum kicks in. And corpus luteum starts to produce two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Does that make sense? So you see, after the ovulation, levels of progesterone dramatically rise and levels of estrogen rise too. What effect elevated levels of estrogen have on gonadotropin releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone? They will decrease them. That makes sense. Now you see here, about here, when corpus luteum degenerates and becomes corpus albicans, what happens to the levels of estrogen and progesterone? Decrease. As they decrease, what happens to the levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone? Cycle starts over. Let me ask you this. When? Like, what should happen or not happen so corpus luteum would degenerate? What should happen or not happen? No fertilization. Corpus luteum degenerates. Another try. Does that make sense? What happens during fertilization? Corpus luteum stays, progesterone levels and estrogen levels stay fairly high, and new ovarian cycle doesn't start. Does that make sense? I would like to go over that process over, but this time you're going to be telling me what's going on, and I'm going to be confirming or denying. Okay, we're going to just review this one more time using that flowchart. A little bit overpopulated, but nevertheless. Ready? It all starts with which hormone? GnRH. Which gland does it act upon? Anterior pituitary. Which produces which two hormones? FSH and LH. What's the function of FSH? Stimulate follicular growth. What's the function of LH? Act on the thecal cells, which eventually produce estrogen. As estrogen levels, so estrogen, what effect does it have on the LH? No. At this point, it inhibits, right? It decreases, blocks LH release. Why do levels of estrogen, like shown here, keep rising? Because follicle becomes bigger. Now at this point, we have huge vesicular follicle. The type of feedback, negative feedback, that's established between LH and estrogen switches to positive feedback. And rising level of estrogen leads to rising levels of LH, luteinizing hormone. luteinizing hormone stimulates what? That has to come to some kind of culmination. It cannot go forever. So what's the culmination of that positive feedback? Ovulation. Remember, positive feedback leads to some kind of a catastrophic change. Catastrophic, not necessarily bad, just profound. That's your profound change. You with me? After the ovulation, what's left behind? Corpus luteum, which produces inhibin, estrogen and progesterone. What effects these hormones have on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary? They decrease the output of GnRH, LH, and FSH. As these hormones, let's focus on gonadotropins. As gonadotropins decrease, how does it affect the output of, and corpus luteum degenerates? What happens to the levels of estrogen and progesterone? They go down, and that decline allows GnRH to restart the cycle. Does that make sense? I will ask you not only about the links, okay, like what happens during ovulation, what kind of feedback loop is established between the hormones. You also need to know, so for instance, I can ask you, what about the levels of hormones in ovulation? I can tell you, for instance, like estrogen is super low, progesterone is super high, which is not true, okay? Or luteinizing hormone is high, estrogen is high, which is true. You see what I'm saying? So these two graphs are your bread and butter. Not for the entire exam, of course, but for the good chunk of it. Okay? We good? Clear? We feel better now? So ovarian cycle is linked to the menstrual cycle. Let me check something. Yeah. So menstrual cycle can be separated into 3 phases. The first phase is the menstrual phase. So it is shown here. Yeah. So that's my actually, from the standpoint of how elegant the mechanism is, I think it's extremely elegant. So menstrual cycle, first 5 days. That's the menstrual flow. Okay? During that time, stratum functionalis is shed. Okay? Now you see that at this point both estrogen and progesterone are pretty low. That makes sense? But at day 5, estrogen levels start to go up. Without looking any forward from our previous conversations about hormones, what effect does estrogen have on the female reproductive organs? Facilitates their growth. So estrogen stimulates the regrowth of stratum functionalis. Here, during that part, you see, this is proliferative stage. Proliferation, growth, right? So not only stratum functionalis regrows, amount of progesterone receptors goes up. Okay? The mucus at the uterine cervix becomes thinner, facilitating the passage of the sperm. Then, at the end of the proliferative stage, ovulation happens. Well, we should say it this way. Proliferative state, the end of proliferative stage happens at the same time when ovulation happens. At this point, there is a there's a proper stratum functionalis in the uterus. You with me so far? After the ovulation, we have so-called secretory stage. Look at the levels of hormones. Estrogen, a little bit in decline, while progesterone rises dramatically. Can you see that green rise of progesterone? Progesterone stimulates the secretion from the mucosa here. Basically, progesterone makes the uterine mucosa ready to implant the blastocyst. Does it make sense? Blood vessels grow, the mucous plug is reformed, so nothing can enter the uterus anymore and stuff like that. You with me? Now, what are, remember, this part and this part, they happen after the ovulation, right? So secondary oocyte is released, hopefully in the fallopian tube. What may or may not happen afterwards? Fertilization. If fertilization happens, what is left behind? Corpus luteum, and it's stable, like it's gonna last. Which hormones does corpus luteum produce? Estrogen, progesterone. Yes, let's focus on progesterone. Progesterone produced by corpus luteum, I'm going to put it in the dashed line, okay? It will stay flat, right? So that progesterone secreted by corpus luteum will maintain stratum functionalis ready for the implantation of the blastocyst. What if secondary oocyte is not fertilized? What happens to corpus luteum? Degenerates. What happens to the progesterone levels? They go down, and then, honestly, from a physiological standpoint, in my opinion, it's really marvelous. So that decrease in progesterone levels leads to the spasm of the spiral arteries that supply blood to the stratum functionalis. When arteries constrict, what happens to the blood flow to the stratum functionalis? It's gone, yeah. If blood flow to a certain tissue is gone, what happens to that tissue? Dies. Stratum functionalis dies. And then spiral arteries dilate. Now, blood vessels, the blood start to go through these arteries into the dead tissue. And it basically washes that tissue away. And that's menses. Does that make sense? And then, ovarian cycle restarts, estrogen goes back, up and stimulates the regrowth of stratum functionalis, and this whole story starts over. Does that make sense? I think it's pretty elegant. Just the whole regulation is so synchronous and so tightly wound up, one hormone with another. So in regards to menstrual cycle, know what happens at the stages and what are the roles for estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen stimulates the regrowth, stimulates proliferative phase, while progesterone stimulates the secretory phase. Good? Now a few words about this hormones. Estrogen has a massive effect on the body, as you know, responsible for the development of the secondary sex characteristics, growth spurt. Usually the puberty in females occurs earlier, by about 2 years, than in males. This is why girls have the growth spurt first, but they also finish the growth spurt first. Girls usually grow till about age of 18. Boys grow till about the age of 21. It varies individually, but that's kind of what it is. Estrogen stimulates the growth of reproductive organs, breasts, accumulation of subcutaneous fat. Stimulates follicle growth, oogenesis. Actually, interesting observation is that obesity stimulates early puberty. It's been shown in the population of American adolescents that obesity is associated with early puberty onset. Estrogen stimulates the increased calcium uptake into the bones. Therefore, bone loss in menopause. And it stimulates the higher level of good cholesterol. Okay. The main function of progesterone is make uterus ready for implantation of the blastocyst. For instance, it inhibits the motility of the uterus, preventing the blastocyst from being expelled by contractions. And it also stimulates the proper breast preparation so they can lactate properly. Okay. Now, menopause. No menses for a year. Men do not have anything like menopause, anything that drastic. When estrogen decreases, reproductive organs and secondary sex organs like breasts start to atrophy, leads to irritability, depression, vasodilation of the skin blood vessels, flashes, associated with osteoporosis and increased risk for cardiovascular disease due to the decreased HDL. The treatment that was proposed is hormone replacement therapy, one of the most profitable drugs ever sold in the US market, generated something like $35 billion of revenue. Later was, and think about this, it's not even a half of the population. It's a small fraction of the population that were taking this. Imagine how many of those pills were distributed. Elevated risk of cardiovascular disease like stroke and heart disease, and elevated risk of some ovarian and breast cancers. So, hormone replacement therapy was discontinued after those clinical data. So now it is prescribed, but very carefully, after the complete evaluation of the patient and for a very short time. That make sense? No quiz today. We're going to do the rest of it on Thursday, and perhaps finish everything on Thursday. I'm not going to push it through, but if we can, we'll do it as fast as I can. I can post the old version like now, but I can work on the newer version. If you want the old version, I can post the old one and just make a remark like an old version, and put the new, because I'm probably gonna remove some of the stuff, so you can go through the newer one and just check.
Can you post the old one?
Sure. Yeah, it's like 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Of course.